Chapter 1. An assessment of the Nouvelle Droite. Why did I suddenly quit the Nouvelle Droite and its most precious flower, Greece, in 1986? The answer is a very simple one. No, I was not recruited by the CIA, nor did I lose my mind through the bite of a rock and roll singing mosquito. Firstly, some work projects prevented me from contributing to the activities of Greece as a militant. Secondly, I noticed that the tone and general orientation of the movement were losing momentum and turning it into a kind of clique and club. And thirdly, the Nouvelle Droite was taking ideological turns with which I increasingly disagreed and which threatened to marginalize it, despite the always verifiable worth of its members, and there was nothing I could do to change its course. 12 years later, my diagnosis has been confirmed. The influence of the Nouvelle Droite has declined. Why? Diagnosis: a considerable loss of influence. Once, every issue of Elements was an ideological barrage that sparked outraged reviews from the mainstream press. Today, the magazine has taken on an almost secretive tone and is ignored by the wider educated public and the decision makers. Likewise, the Colloque Parisien no longer received the media coverage they enjoyed in the 1980s. While they may still attract roughly the same number of people, have they not become the nostalgic meetings of an association of veterans? Besides, I doubt whether Greece is still as capable as it was in previous years of filling the halls of large cities in France and Belgium with weekly conferences and seminars. The only recent instance in which the Nouvelle Droite had any relevance was the debate launched on Crisis magazine regarding the fraud of contemporary art, a central problem that shocked the little subsidized masters and gigolo artists of mainstream non art. Alas, this media visibility was short lived and insufficient. Ultimately, it was largely ignored by the wider public, unlike the heated polemics on central issues we continue to spark up until the mid 1980s, and which spread everywhere from the United States to the USSR. Today, even the most interesting writings from the Nouvelle Droite only circulate in the narrow milieu of its followers, while the platitudes, virtuous and verbose inanities, and self-righteous quibbles of people like Ferry Serres and Comte Sponville, just like Bordeaux's idiocies and talentless gloom of Bernard Henry Levy, mediocre, mediatized intellectuals sponsored by the current soft totalitarianism, are spreading through the insolent self-importance of idiots. This is a defeat, but losing a battle does not necessarily mean losing the war. In brief, the Nouvelle Droite has been confined to the periphery of the debate. Regrettably, it has turned into an ideological ghetto. It no longer sees itself as a powerhouse for the diffusion of energies with the ultimate aim of acquiring power, but rather as a publishing enterprise that also organizes conference but has limited ambitions. Clearly, behind this process of marginalization lie both external causes, a hostile or indifferent milieu, and internal ones, due to the movement itself. The latter are more crucial. One can only recover from a temporary defeat by acknowledging it as such and assuming responsibility for it. Ambition comes from modesty. No progress can be made without self criticism. Those who blame others, enemies, and the political climate for their own failures do not deserve to win. For it is in the logic of things for enemies to oppress you and circumstances to prove hostile. The mistake lies in exercising reality by adopting the morals of intention as opposed to those of consequences through unrealistic arguments. You know, we have as many people as before at the colloquy. It is full of young people at the university today. Hell, we should stop issuing reassuring reports that only serve to conceal reality. It is necessary to avoid sterile polemics and accept positive self criticism. The question is, why is the Nouvelle Droite which possessed an impressive ideological armory, objectively going downhill? Are we witnessing its final decline or merely a standstill that foreshadows its relaunching? I will attempt to answer this question, but first, two preliminary observations are in order. The first is that no one, within what might vaguely be defined as the ideological right in Europe, has yet managed to acquire the kind of intellectual influence the Nouvelle Droite had at the turn of the 1980s. Its only potential heir is the pan European intellectual movement Synergies, which is led, amongst others, by Robert Stuckers, and which strikes me as being on the right track for its pursues ambitious aims. Still, the match is not over. A second observation. In 1998, the only genuinely tangible influence of the Nouvelle Droite on society at large is that exercised by its runaway members, now in the Front National, which they have driven to take on anti American course, a real mental revolution for this milieu. On the other hand, the influence of the Nouvelle Droite can be detected in the formulation of a widespread cultural and economic hostility towards Americanization, hostility which remains largely ineffectual given the indolence of political decision makers. So, overall, the concrete ideological impact of the Nouvelle Droite has been rather meagre. From 1986, I started to feel that there was no longer any real fervour left, and that a clique spirit and literary pagan romanticism were prevailing over historical will. I could see that the chief aim consisted no longer in the establishment of a school of thought, the exercising of concrete ideological influence, and the development of a radical thought through shocking ideas, but rather in a sort of elegant intellectualism and the entrenchment of a community, a noble thing when it relies on an established power, but a demobilizing one when reduced to the tautology of a clique. It is necessary to analyze the causes of this decline, which, having taken place in less than a decade, was more sudden and striking than the old action français. How and why did the main alternative ideological movement to have emerged in post war Europe turn out to be merely a comet? What lessons can we gain from this, and what should we do now? Can the mechanism be put into motion again? Certainly, no one knows what will remain in future history of the mass of texts produced by the Nouvelle Droite and its followers. No doubt there will be some continuations, restatements, and reinterpretations, perhaps a revolution in 2050. But let us simply stick to the present for the time being, before moving on to discuss the strategies for a restoration. The causes of the loss of influence of the Nouvelle Droite. It is quite true that cultural societies, theoretical magazines, and new intellectual systems must all face great obstacles, which did not exist only 20 years ago. The end of the pyramidal spread of knowledge, the firepower of the cultural entertainment industries that marginalize and conceal all new or rebellious thought, the net like multiplication of medias of all sorts. These external causes, however, do not explain everything. The Nouvelle Droite might have turned obstacles into opportunities by adapting its communication strategy to the new milieu. It failed to do so. We failed to do so. We failed to see the meteor that was approaching. I believe that the chief causes for this withdrawal are: number one, the competitive emergence of the Front National and the thought of Antonio Gramsci, which was badly understood by the Nouvelle Droite. Number two, a tightening of censorship through a blacking out and closing off of the mainstream media, which followed the strengthening of ideological interdictions against all forms of alternative thought. The Nouvelle Droite submitted to these dictates, not daring to fight them through a creative, disorientating, and provocative reaction. Number three, the profound inadequacy of Nouvelle Droite publications with respect to current media communication strategies, combined with an editorial tactic that was hardly effective. The continued Number four, the continued adoption of an outdated apparatus logic of the type to be found in political parties, which was not appropriate for a movement and school of thought, as well as journalistic or editorial policy, and which led cadres to flee on account of problems with the apparatus. Number five, a certain ideological fossilization combined with the persistence of a rightist cultural attachment to and sentimentalizing of the past, and the abandonment, in many fields, of the idea of radical thought, the only kind of thought capable of sending a shockwave to arrest the media blackout. To this, we can add the contradiction between implicit Euro imperial references and an explicitly ethno pluralist or even immigrationist stance. Number six, a previously unknown doctrinal softening on economic and scientific matters, and a burgeoning of literary discourse. Number seven, the favoring of criticism over positive formulations, of reaction over action. Let us examine some of these points. The Front National and the Gramscian strategy. At first sight, the Front National could not have been a rival of the Nouvelle Droite, which never presented itself as being French nationalist. Yet, different airlocks exist in the family of the right. The more ideologically unrefined public or clientele is always attracted by the strongest pole. In the early 1980s, Greece was the most important organization in this area of politics. The Front National was considered a microgroup of good for nothings. We used to see them as being bigoted, papist, reactionary, servile towards America, jingoist, and anti European. Le Pen, this pirate faced, confusion stirring, neo boulangist old soldier, was barred from our meetings. Then, by a twist of history, everything changed. The front gained irresistible ascendancy, and Greece was no longer the pole of attraction that monopolized the movement. Like water leaking from a tap, cadre and leaders, even at the cost of ideological revisionism, something all too human, moved to where something was happening, the Front National. Bardet, Blot, Legalo, Martinez, Magret, Milo, Vial, and 20 others or so, all worthy men who were closely connected to Greece or otherwise involved with it, transferred their skills to the Front National. Had it never appeared, it is likely that important human resources would have remained in the sphere of the Nouvelle Droite, a veritable flight of brains. Another reason why the front caused the decline of Greece is the former's enticing of the media, a phenomenon admin know well. The media, fascinated by the shocking political incorrectness of the Front National and of its president, soon forgot all about the Nouvelle Droite, which produced texts and events that were less attractive and provoking. Since the late 1980s, the Front has served as a media screen for the Nouvelle Droite, which, as we shall see, has proven incapable of reacting and opening counterfire. It should also be said that one of the handicaps of the Nouvelle Droite has been a poor reading of Gramsciism, based on the adoption of the all is cultural and all is intellectual strategy. In our metapolitical Gramscian strategy, we had simply overlooked the fact that the cultural battle Gramsci promoted was associated with the political and economic battle of the Italian Communist Party, and as such did not take place in the void. But unfortunately, we had never actually read Gramsci. Ours was only Bragio pseudo-Gramscism. In order to prove effective, ideological and cultural action must be supported by concrete political forces, which it integrates and extends. Chevaudemont's former Ceres, for instance, a satellite of the PS or SOS Racism, another of its satellites, are clear examples of successive propaganda. In defining the founding idea behind the Nouvelle Droite in the 1970s, we had simply underestimated the political element. By overestimating the cultural and intellectual pole through a distorted analysis of the works of Augustin Chochin, and which found inspiration in cultural circles from before the French Revolution, we all too soon buried what would have been and still is a winning political strategy, without grasping the contemporary formula, intellectual and cultural propaganda combined with electoral and political mobilization. We had forgotten we were no longer living in the 18th century, that elections of various sorts were taking place every 6 months, and that politicians were the media heralds of a party system. The all is cultural strategy only worked for the non elective regimes of the past. We had announced the death of politics all too soon. Evidence for this is the fact that Liberation, is more concerned by the mediatization of Pierre Vial's association Terre et Pupil, a cultural and intellectual movement coordinated but with the activities of a party, the Front National, that it is by Madeleine and Juppé's circles of buddies. The reason for this, intellectual movements that gain public attention pose challenging problems along with a concrete political threat. The Nouvelle Droite has thus found itself in an increasingly precarious situation, devoid of any political backing and cut off from its own natural public, whose outlook was for the most part close to that of the Front National. The public of the Nouvelle Droite was puzzled by our third worldist and pro Islamic positions, which were ideologically incomprehensible and were taken as the expression of a bourgeois way of thinking, indifferent towards immigration problems, or even as evidence of flirtation on our part with the non Jacobin left. From that moment onwards, unable to appeal to a new public, the Nouvelle Droite was progressively enveloped by the Front. The cultural value of its publications simply could not make up for its ideological drift. No doubt, as we shall see, increasing hostility on the part of the media also made the spread of the ideas of the Nouvelle Droite increasingly difficult. Like Royer and Freud, de Benoit's work has been confined by the system to limited spheres of influence. But make no mistake, this is no excuse. The strong pressure put upon decision makers by well integrated minority circles and lobbies such as the SOS Racism or Greenpeace and the various ideologies that inspire them cannot exclusively be explained on the basis of their political ultra correctness and total complicity with the system. It is also due to the fact that they have been capable of powerfully delivering their messages. By using all the tricks of the new media circus, the Nouvelle Droite has not managed to do the same, but has remained tied to an obsolete view of how ideas are circulated. The surfacing within the European population of a persistent faction destabilized by the crisis and revolting against the concrete results of the system would have served as a new breeding ground for the Nouvelle Droite. Number two, the tightening of censorship and the Nouvelle Droite's failure to react to it. In the early 1980s, soft totalitarianism against all incorrect forms of expression tightened its grasp. Once the generation of 68, which used its slogan, "It's forbidden to forbid," came into power, it distinguished itself for its conformism, taste for prohibition, and desire for ideological order. Censorship is exercised both through the legislative erosion of free thinking and writing, even by the use of lawsuits, and in most cases through intentional silence on the part of the media when it comes to people or things that might prove upsetting, a demonizing and blacking out strategy. The Nouvelle Droite has certainly fallen victim to this censorship, which was even made the object of a Greece meeting. But let us not exaggerate things. I fear that censorship is invoked as a pretext to justify lack of will and the failure to take any risks. Each form of censorship represents a stimulus, which form of oppression of a challenge. One should rise and face challenges, not complain. Why was the Nouvelle Droite threatened with a ban, with persecutions and violence? Truth is, it was never capable of managing and turning to its own advantage conformity of ideas, a pertinent notion first coined by Alain de Benoit and later mediatized by Jean-Francois Kahn, who paradoxically is actually a lackey of political correctness and hegemonic thinking. On the other hand, at the height of its glory, starting from 1979, the Nouvelle Droite was subjected to a number of serious media attacks and even physical acts of aggression. But it was this very air of battle that had given it its drive and elicited creative reactions on its part. There is no need to come up with bad excuses, overemphasizing the treachery and effectiveness of censorship. Silence on the part of the media can also be explained with their indifference towards the Nouvelle Droite, a movement which is no longer surprising, shocking, or provoking, which, despite the clear value of its writings, ceased to offer anything new. I bet, and we'll get back to this point, that had the Nouvelle Droite resumed its former fighting spirit, had it sought to launch provoking debates and formulate radical ideas, the media blackout would have been short lived. The media must necessarily attack and hence advertise everything that opposes their system. I am paid to know it. Aggressions are opportunities. They mediatize thought and enable it to grow sharper and react. With both skill and daring, one must outrage people if he wishes to be listened to, and most importantly, he must prevent his thought from becoming bourgeois. Number 3. An incorrect publishing policy. The Nouvelle Droite has 3 magazines, which are more like light boys than lighthouses. Nouvelle École, Crisis, and Éléments. The function of the first 2 of these, which are theoretical in nature, is to establish intellectual foundations. By contrast, Éléments, the chief media bridge, is badly positioned. It is intended to be the cutting edge among Nouvelle Droite publications, to address an educated public and persuade people in outside milieu, but it falls short of its target. It lacks dynamism, addresses too many literary and intellectual topics that do not serve its purpose, and engages with few social issues. It contains long, stiff, and often repetitive articles and inadequate graphics with bad captions, defects that limit its media appeal. The layout of the magazine, particularly in its new version, is aesthetically impeccable, yet too austere and quite unsuited for an ambitious publication. Still, behind all this, talent is still to be found. Editorial blunders alternate with excellent reports, although there are too few of the latter. The enquiry on the noxiousness of cars and the dead end reached by progress, for instance, which are featured on issue 86, October 1996, represents an example of what Elements should be discussing systematically. Topics of great interest to everyone and which capture readers' attention, a sort of intellectual detoxification and ideological revival. While the analyses made are often very sharp and concrete, practical theses and suggestions are lacking that go beyond mere criticism and raise questions such as, let's open the debate, what is to be done? Another mistake is publishing dispersion. I first noticed this shortcoming in the early 1980s. We should not multiply our publications, but concentrate our forces. Charles Champetier introduced me to the small magazine Cartouche, which is full of dynamic and stimulating invective. Fine, but anyone working in the communication sector could tell you that the logic behind this magazine should be incorporated and merged with Elements. Short pieces, striking information, a style that isn't stuffy, etc. Even Crisis, a magazine regarded as presentable, but why, tends to overlap with Nouvelle École and all too often succumbs to the appeal of Parisian slang, which does not always help carry on the debate. To sum up my argument, I believe that some texts can only be aimed at inner circulation, but that many others can be presented and circulated outside at the heart of the system. We should never underestimate our own skills. Talent always prevails over censorship when it is accompanied by daring and intelligence. Ideological mistakes. The ambiguity of the ideological line of the Nouvelle Droite, which became more marked in the 1980s, constitutes the chief reason for its decline. To this, despite high-quality analytic texts, I am thinking, for instance, of Champetier's work Homo Consumans or Alain de Benoit's article on colours in issue of 50 of Nouvelle École. We should add a return to doctrinal invective and a sort of intellectual bombast. Let us now examine these mistakes. Number 1. From the start, the members of the Nouvelle Droite and Greece, including myself, have practiced semantic clumsiness and permanent slips. The double talk of many circles, magazines, and books was caught between oblique references to issues, authors, and iconographic motifs typical of the far right, particularly that of Germany, and anti-racist, pro-Islamic, pseudo-leftist, or third worldist tirades, which did not fool the enemy but puzzled our readership. I am happy to point to these shortcomings for which I was, too, responsible prior to realizing how noxious they were. Today, the Nouvelle Droite has not rectified these mistakes, but if anything, worsened them. Number two, second serious mistake, the exploitation and politicization of paganism, starting from a correct Nietzschean assessment regarding the egalitarian, leveling, and ethno-masochist harmfulness of Christian evangelism. The Nouvelle Droite has set up a neo-pagan corpus that suffers a number of handicaps. Paradoxically, the unconscious starting point of this neo-paganism was a Christian perspective, the countering of dogma with a counter-doctrine. Paganism, as such, is non-existent. What exists are different, potentially countless kinds of paganism. The Nouvelle Droite presented itself as a pagan church, one, moreover, without any deity. But paganism, by its very nature, is unserviceable as a metapolitical banner, unlike Christianity, Islam, or Judaism. Second handicap, a virulent anti Catholicism, where indifference should have been more in order, at times bordering on anti clericism, combined with an open friendliness towards Islam. The latter is a risky attitude, given that Europe is facing a concrete Islamic threat and represents a particularly absurd ideological stance, considering that Islam is a rigid theocratic monotheism, religion of the desert, in its coarsest form, far more than classic Catholic henotheism, which is strongly mixed with pagan polytheism. Moreover, the essence of the pagan perspective is to position oneself not against, but after or alongside something which strikes me as being far more creative and innovative. I personally adopted this mistaken approach, which the Nouvelle Droite never corrected. Third handicap. This paganism was, and still seems to be, marked by forms of folklore that find no space in the actual culture of Europeans, as opposed to what takes place in the United States, and which I have always struggled against in a friendly spirit but in vain. The result of this, one potential public never turned towards the Nouvelle Droite, while another fled from it. Why? Firstly, because many people could not understand this preference assigned to paganism over more important and concrete political matters, such as the destruction of the European ethnosphere and anti-natalist masochism in the part of the governments. Another consequence, the media effect of the promotion of paganism as a brand name, particularly in France, was to stir repulsion. An excellent appeal to paganism gives the idea of a sect. As I was once told by a great French actress who was privately close to the ideas of the Nouvelle Droite, but unwilling, like many others, to mingle political ideology with a para-religious elements. Such an attitude may be deplored, but still, there are certain rules of propaganda that cannot be ignored. As for the attacks against the Catholic Church, there would have been, and would be, more apt if directed against the para-Trotskyism, immigrationism, and self-ethnophobia of the high clergy, which favours a return to the hard evangelism of the original monotheistic sources, the Bolshevism of antiquity. This masochistic and stupid high clergy that, with false contrition, is favouring the erection of mosques on European soil. Two books have contributed to shape my outlook: The Antichrist by Nietzsche and The Gods of Greece by Walter Otto, as did Pierre Weil's initiatory Oath of Delphi in the early 1980s. By Apollo's sanctuaries at sunrise, followers from Greece and Burgundy, Tuscany and Bavaria, Brittany and Wallonia, Flanders and Catalonia swore to keep the pagan soul alive. That's all very well, but pagan actions such as this should remain inside affairs. The pagan soul is an inner strength that must permeate all ideological and cultural expressions. It is like the heart of a nuclear reactor. It is not something to be openly displayed through instrumental slogans. One doesn't go around saying, I am pagan. One is pagan. More prosaically, I believe that this insistence on paganism as a para-political banner has puzzled the natural public of the Nouvelle Droite, as if the wish were to divert attention from secondary matters, while also starting an artificial conflict with traditional Catholics, who were not all that Christian after all. The exploitation of paganism has been a huge communications and propaganda mistake, which has distanced the Nouvelle Droite from any Catholic milieus initially favourable to it. which shared its ideas but were sentimentally tied to local traditions. We have made this serious blunder from the start, and it still waits to be rectified. Third mistake, an overemphasized folklorism and excessive cult of rootedness. The soul of European artistic culture lies not in small pyramidal objects of baked clay, painted furniture from Schleswig Holstein, Breton bonnets, or in the naive wooden sculptures of Scandinavian farmers. Rather, it is found in the Reims Cathedral, the double helix Italian stairway in the Chateau de Chambord, the drawings by Leonardo da Vinci, the comics by Liberator and the Brussels School, the design of Ferraris and the German French Scandinavian Ariane 5 rockets. By reducing European culture to mere folklore, this is depreciated and dragged down to the level of the primitive art so dear to Jacques Chirac. What ought to have been done with Nietzschean anti egalitarian logic and Cartesian common sense was affirm the superiority, that's right, the superiority of European artistic and cultural forms above all others. But the ethno pluralist dogma, which stands in contradiction to anti egalitarianism, prevented this. Having put too much faith in ethnocultural relativism and imbued with the guilt stirring masochism that is so widespread, we didn't dare affirm the superiority of our own civilization. Had we carefully done so, we would have appealed to a wide public of people who would have been struck by our daring. Too many writings on European traditions, often connected to defunct and mythical folk customs, made us forget the crux of the debate, the self affirmation of contemporary European culture, the geo-demographical threats looming over it, and the need for a reconquista. Folklorism, acting as a leveling mechanism, has situated European culture on the same level as others, when it was instead necessary to implicitly and adroitly affirm its creative primacy. On the other hand, this often folkish traditionalism serves the conquering spirit of American cultural products. It neutralizes European culture and renders it into museum exhibits. Folklorism has failed as an identitarian bond for the contemporary cultural battle and is having a disarming effect instead. Contemporary European culture is creatively resisting in any fields music, architecture, design, leading technologies, sculpture. The Nouvelle Droite has not paid adequate attention to this. The fourth mistake lies in the insufficient attention paid to concrete problems. The Nouvelle Droite today has, even more than in the past, been too concerned with what may be termed culturalism and historicism. In the late 1970s, it had achieved a degree of mediatization and influence thanks to the ideological inroads and new debates on eugenics, the biological revolution, IQ, differences among various populations, ethnology, new economic perspectives, the place of sexuality in the society of spectacle, etc. I believe that the Nouvelle Droite and its publications verge too much on the side of commemoratorian literary culture and antiquated nostalgic forms of intellectualism. This is a real shame, for the few treatments it gives of crucial contemporary issues are of high quality, as can easily be discerned from the pages of Crisis. I wouldn't like to give the wrong impression. I am criticizing the Nouvelle Droite not so much for what it does, as for that which it does not do or no longer does, or to be objective for what it does not do enough. It is necessary to discuss things such as the Asian financial crisis and the biotechnology revolution, and launch discussions and debates on issues such as European federalism for or against the United States of Europe, the effects of the internet, European space policy, the solar system, the deterioration of the environment, the consequences of an aging population on pension funds, the boom in Latin American music, the outburst in female homosexuality, the world of pornography, sport, the demographic colonization of Europe, energy policies and nuclear energy, transport and crime. The Nouvelle Droite will only prove creative and credible once more if it manages to formulate disorientating doctrines regarding all major contemporary issues, and if it is able to establish a new ideological corpus, presented in the form of a debate rather than dogma on economic, scientific, geopolitical, and sociological matters. Fifth ideological mistake, third worldism. I have fully contributed to this and am willing to exercise self criticism. Alain de Benoit's essay, Europe Tiers Monde, Meme Combat, a crucial work on the matter, and the articles I myself wrote on the issue in the early 1980s, driven by misdirected anti Americanism, have been ideological and strategic impasses which have worried me since. No folk in history fights the same battle as other peoples. Every alliance is temporary. Besides, the very notion of third world has crumbled. What we have are China, India, the future Muslim empire. The third world does not exist. Third worldism, which in our political milieu served as an awkward certificate of anti racism, ignores actual history, the immigration and geopolitical pressure of the South against the North. What is worse, this misplaced third worldism has been accompanied by a disconcerting and naive pro Islamic stance to which we all succumbed when an objective, aggressive, revanchist, and comprehensible threat was actually being posed by the Arab Muslim world against Europe, seen as a land to be conquered. It is quite true that dogmas make you blind. They are also dangerous. It is clear that for the most part of the public of the Nouvelle Droite, and others too, do not share these surrealist views of ours. Sixth, ideological mistake, anti Americanism, and the feeling of being colonized. In the early 1970s, in line with the anti communism that was still prevalent on the right, Greece was pro American and supported the West. Thus, in an old issue of Nouvelle École, under a photo of the Rockefeller Center in New York, we find the following caption: The energy at the heart of power. In 1975, however, Giorgio Loci made us do an about face. A special issue of Nouvelle École was published by Alain de Benoit and Loci, which divided the civilization of the United States from that of Europe, its roots. Later on, following the same drive, I suggested an alternative ideological axis based on the separation of Europe from the West, a revolutionary idea in a milieu which made the West its banner. We sought to affirm the idea that the notion of Western civilization or Western ideology was not necessarily compatible with the destiny of Europe as a land of brother peoples. Western, the West, is an abstract geographical notion, which the true fracture is between North and South, for the vital geopolitical space of Europe extends out to the Russian Far East. This was the ideological. It was distorted, however, by the mistaken assumption that a structural solidarity exists between the peoples of Europe and those of Africa, Asia, and Latin America against the Yankees. Actually, as we shall see, the United States is better regarded as a rival and opponent than an enemy.